and it is my pleasure today to introduce Jonathan Williams.
Good afternoon, everybody, and greetings from the land of make-believe, as I like to say, Washington, D.C., where I come from. As the great Ronald Reagan would say, Washington is an island surrounded by reality. And so whenever I have a chance to hop off that island and into reality and back to a good state like Kansas, I always take that opportunity. And over the years of working with my good friends at KPI, Kansas has almost become an adopted second home state for me. I think this might be my 25th trip or so to Wichita since I've been working in public policy. So it's always good to come back and work with a lot of friends. Good to see so many familiar faces around the audience today and talk about what I think is going to be a huge issue going forward, and that is the tax cuts of Kansas, the reform package, and where to go from here. And I'm going to provide a national perspective. We work at ALEC with state lawmakers from all 50 states, Republicans, Democrats, independents, libertarians, vegetarians, whoever wants to talk about public policy issues, we're more than happy to work with them and talk about best practices. And we have about 2,000 state lawmakers who are members of ours, and they join, they pay their own dues to be ALEC members, and then they have the ability to look at our research like my book, Rich States, Poor States, which you have in front of you. And in fact, in this edition of the book, we've devoted an entire chapter to what we call America's most discussed tax reform effort. That is the very tax reform effort that happened here in Kansas. And so there's a lot to learn. Somebody just asked me the other day, so tell me the Kansas story. I was like, do you have 5 hours? Because it's not real easy to tell in a way that is comprehensive. It's easy for those that would like to throw bombs, and generally the people that don't like Kansas tax reform are people that don't like tax reform and tax cuts, and they like big government generally. And they've tried to use the Kansas example as an example to stop tax cuts in other states. As we travel around the country, I've traveled and spoken to lawmakers in all 50 states now. One of the first questions they get if they're looking to enact fundamental tax reform is, well, didn't Kansas try that and didn't it fail and basically ruin the state? And our answer is, no, it did not, absolutely. But the other part of it is there are some really important policy lessons that we can learn and things that hopefully other states won't repeat as they go through their own process of tax reform. What I wanted to talk a little bit about is just generally what we're seeing across the 50 states. As we like to say, the states are laboratories of democracy. And it's very interesting in that I think the founders had it absolutely right that decisions ought to not be made all in Washington, D.C. They ought to be made in the states and with the people of the states. And you ask the average person on the street today, what is federalism? What does federalism mean to you? What kind of answers do you think you get? All over the map. You get a lot of blank stares, quite honestly. You get another answer quite commonly, which is federalism is the federal government taking over more authority over things, which is exactly the opposite of the 10th Amendment. Anybody know the 10th Amendment off the top of their head? It's one of the most important in my view. Those powers not directly given to the federal government should be reserved for the states, or more importantly, the people of the states. Because at the end of the day, we shouldn't be just talking about states' rights. There's no such thing. States don't have rights. States have power. People have rights. And we need to be talking about policies that empower people. But for those of us who believe in markets and believe in competition, the best thing that we have going for us are these 50 laboratories of democracy. Because at the end of the day, states can choose, for better or for worse, their policies. But there's an upper limit at what states can get away with. Look at California and New York and the big problem states that have been enacting horrible tax increases and big spending policies for decades. Just this last time we did redistricting in 2010, for the first time in state history, California will not gain a congressional seat because of its population losses to the other 49 states. That's probably good news for everybody in this room, by the way. It means one less Nancy Pelosi in Congress. On the other hand, New York has lost 14 congressional seats on net over the last 50 years because of the huge population outflows leaving a place like New York. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail of why big government policies continue to fail at the state level. I'm from Michigan, as was mentioned. I'll let the joke go about water for now. I'm from Saginaw, Michigan, which makes this issue of economic development very personal to me. Anybody been to Saginaw, Michigan before? A couple people. We were a town that 50 years ago was 100,000 people. Today we're at 47,000 people because the policies obviously the auto industry, left Michigan, left the United States, and it's unfortunately a place where people say they're from today. It's not a place that people are going, not a place that's attracting new entrepreneurs, it's attracting new to activity for business. You know, after moving to DC about 10 years ago, I was struck by the number of cranes I saw on the horizon. It's probably bad because it's big government and the growth of DC is being fueled by big government and all the cranes, but just reminded me, I never saw cranes growing up in Saginaw, Michigan. There were no new buildings going up in Saginaw, Michigan because we got policy wrong in Detroit, in Flint, in Saginaw. And so this is a very personal issue for me. Now, the slide that I have up here, it might be a little bit hard to see in the back, so I'll try to describe some of these slides. People always ask me, what's happening in Washington today? The answer is not much when it comes to fundamental real policy reforms. And you may be asking, what is this slide with a very young and dapper looking Senator Bob Dole, by the way, on the left there, if you can make that out. That was 1986, 30 years ago, and that was the last time we saw fundamental tax reform in Washington, D.C., when President Ronald Reagan signed it into law October 23rd of 1986. Just to tell you how slow we're moving at the federal level when it comes to free market tax and budget reforms. Now, on the other hand, at the state level, just this last year, 17 states significantly cut taxes. The year before that, 14. The year before that, 17. So the states are taking the lead, and that's good. You know, they are using what they've been given in terms of the competition between the states to attract new businesses, new jobs, and better economic vitality. Now, this gets to the root of the question of Kansas tax reform experiment, which is, can you talk about taxes without talking about spending? The answer is a resounding no. Taxes and spending are two sides of the same equation, and you cannot have a fundamental discussion about one without talking about the other. Now, one of my favorite lines is from the great columnist and economist Thomas Sowell, which is, what's the first law of economics? There's this thing called scarcity of resources, right? A little refresher, scarcity of resources, Econ 101. What's the first law of politics? To ignore the first law of economics, right? And that's how we get into the problems that we have, is that we know what the right thing to do is, we just don't do it very often when it comes to policy making. And this is not picking on Kansas per se, this is a problem endemic across the United States at the state and federal level. And what we hope to say is, instead of just taking last year's budget and adding some sort of automatic growth and inflation and caseload and getting next year's budget, we should be having a more fundamental conversation about the core functions of government. What is it that state government exists to do versus what can be done in the private sector, what can be done in the local levels of government, and then decide on what are our priorities, and let's fund those priorities very well. So a case study that I always like to talk about is Washington State, not a conservative bastion by any stretch of the imagination. They solved more than a $2 billion budget shortfall without a dime of tax increases because they went through this exercise of priority-based budgeting. And before they did this exercise, their agencies didn't even have to have mission statements as to what kind of value they provided for taxpayers. They weren't deciding needs versus wants, and they were just taking last year's budget, and all of a sudden then the conservative budget was a 4% growth budget and the liberal budget was a 10% growth budget. You know what, that's what gets you into trouble over time, is if you don't have those more holistic discussions about spending. Now, the biggest threat to state finances today, and this is not unique to Kansas, but I will say it's a big problem for Kansas in terms of percentages. The dollar amounts are much smaller in Kansas on unfunded pension liability than you would say Illinois, of course, which has been in the news, or California or New York. But in terms of percent funded, Kansas pension system is one of the worst in the country. Now, there's been some tweaks done to it recently with some cash balance plan offered, and of course there was the pension obligation bonding, which I guess, depending on how you look at it, may kick the can down the road with new debt to pay off some of the existing pension debt. But nonetheless, I think the example of what's happened in Puerto Rico over the last year, the example of what happened in Detroit, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and the example of what's going on in Illinois presently should illustrate that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when the pension costs really hit home and it really starts to divert money away from spending. So it should have something that liberals ought to be worried about as well, because if they want to spend more on certain areas of government, pension costs are going to continue to eat in to that other spending priorities. And it's also got something for conservatives to be upset about, which is it's going to take tax cuts off the agenda for many, many years just to pay and do the makeup payments on pension obligations. Now, with the fair market valuation, and this is something that gets a little bit wonky, you know, generally when I say I'm an economist, people run for the exits anyways, because we are kind of a wonky group and people think we're going to be real boring. We like to set expectations low, though, so if you think we're going to be really boring, then even if you're okay, people are okay with it. You know, the famous line of the difference between an introverted tax economist and an extroverted tax economist, right? The introverted tax economist looks at his shoes when he talks to you. The extroverted tax economist looks at your shoes when he talks to you. So that's the world that I come from, and I benefit from low expectations. I really appreciate that. But getting into the details on pensions is a wonky topic. It's the issue of, will you earn 7 or 8% every year for the next 30 years in your investment portfolio? Anybody here? If you are going to, please talk to me. I have some money to invest, because it's not out there. But here's the problem. States are allowed to assume whatever they want in terms of what they're going to earn in the pension system for the next 20 or 30 years. That type of, maybe careless to say, Enron-style accounting is what is getting pension systems into major problem across the states, and something needs to be done about it. Kansas, the numbers are absolutely massive if you use a more realistic discount rate. The bond rating agencies say you should use probably a 5% assumed rate of return. If you're using a risk-free rate of return, it's under 3%. And then the unfunded liabilities, for instance, balloon all the way up to $36 billion, which breaks down to, per capita, almost $13,000 for every man, woman, and child in Kansas, and you owe in unfunded liabilities. That's a huge problem to tackle going forward. Now, there's a solution, luckily, from the 50 laboratories of democracy, and that is many states have decided to move towards the private sector model, which probably, if you're in the private sector, you're very familiar with your 401k. The only place that 401ks basically don't exist today are state and local governments, with some exceptions, which I have up on the screen here. Michigan, my home state, Alaska, Utah, and actually most recently your neighbors to the south in Oklahoma in 2014 enacted pension reform to say all new hires as of this date will go into a new deal of a 401k pension. We're going to honor the promises that we've made to current workers, current retirees, and that's important to honor promises if you've made them, but realize that those promises are not tenable going forward. They're not going to be affordable going forward, and that's why states are moving in this direction of 401ks, and that's a positive, because you look at the polling, and I'm not going to go through all this data here, but a huge percentage, a big majority of Americans of a big national poll recently going through down the list, no matter what kind of question and how you frame it on pensions, they want pension reform. They want people to be going into a 401k system that's more portable and better for younger workers anyways. I'm going to skip through a couple of these, but I will highlight the fact that this is not a partisan issue. Mayor Rahm Emanuel, that right-wing Republican in Chicago, never let a good crisis go to waste, Rahm Emanuel, has said our taxpayers cannot afford to choose between pensions and police officers and pensions and paved streets. And they get back to that issue that if you believe in more money for public services, unfunded pension liabilities are a huge problem going forward. And here's the, if you don't want to take my word for it, take the bankruptcy judge in Detroit's word for it. This was Stephen Rhodes. He ended a 25-year career on the bench. This was his seminal case working on the Detroit bankruptcy. And here are his 3 takeaways so you all can avoid the fate of Detroit. And I think that's hopefully something that every state and every city can agree upon. You don't want to be the next Detroit, right? Here are his 3 takeaways. Make your pension plan contributions. If you're going to have a defined benefit system, make the contributions. Of course, that didn't happen recently here. Secondly, make sure you're calculating your unfunded liabilities properly, not using this funny accounting that allows you to assume whatever you want to assume for rates of return. And then finally, rethink the defined benefit pension model. So to avoid the fate of Detroit, the bankruptcy, the huge financial insolvency, take it from the bankruptcy judge himself, how you can avoid that. Now, to the other side of the fiscal coin, tax policy, one of my favorites. Here are principles that we've distilled down over the years as we think the most important principles when you're thinking about what good tax policy that's focused on the taxpayer looks like. Simplicity, transparency, those are pretty straightforward. You look at why people hate taxes. What's the most unpopular tax? Anyone want to take a guess? Property taxes. We have a very informed crowd here. So property taxes are the least popular tax, and why is that? because people see the burden of government when they cut a check to their local government to pay their property taxes, right? They see the burden of government face on, and they can tell what that really means to them, what they're giving up. Maybe it's that vacation they just gave up because their property tax bill's too high. And so people have that connection. That's why tax transparency is so important, to keep a lid on the growth of government. Neutrality. This one maybe is not so straightforward. That is, in our view, it's not the business of the government to be picking winners and losers. It's the business of the marketplace to be picking winners and losers. Unfortunately, states, cities, certainly the federal government, all fall into this trap that they want to be the kingmakers. They want to be the person writing the press release and cutting the ribbons to say, I just brought 100 jobs into my state, right? And so while everybody should be looking for ways to grow their economy and allow the private sector to create jobs in their districts and their states, it's all about how you go about doing it. Are you going to do it through a crony approach where it's top-down government micromanagement, really central planning approach, or are you going to do it through the free market? And what we've seen is a couple of things on the tax cronyism front, as we like to call it. Anybody seen the TV ads that New York State has been running? Come into our state, 10 years tax-free. Anybody believe that? Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure. My staff has reviewed that from New York. We don't think more than a handful of companies will probably ever qualify, given the extreme rules, the hoops that they're required to jump through. And by the way, if you empower government to be the central planner, and it happens to be in New York, they're not a very conservative state government, last time I checked. They don't like oil and gas companies. You think if an oil and gas company were to go there and say, we want to drill in the Marcellus Shale and we want to qualify for the 10 years tax-free, what's the answer going to be, right? Not. What about a gun manufacturer? But the problem is once you've done that and empowered government to start picking winners and losers, we shouldn't be surprised when they only pick the ones that are most closest related to the government or most ingratiated to the current government in the state capital. But here's to highlight how bad New York has been. They've given away more than 52,000 specific tax benefits to one company over another over the last 20 years, 5 times greater than Michigan at second worst. So that's the kind of magnitude we're looking at in terms of states trying to pick winners and losers. Now, that being said, it's important to note that there's 2 ways to compete out there. There's the free market way, which is low taxes for everybody and let the best man or woman win in the marketplace. And then there's this approach, which is really another form of competition. It's just crony competition. And it's very important to note that even a place like New York realizes that their taxes are too high, so they have to figure out a way to compete. They're just doing it the wrong way. And we always in rich states, poor states like to talk about how Americans continue to vote with their feet and vote with their pocketbook and go to states with lower taxes, or for instance, the 9 states without personal income taxes. And I know, working with some of the lawmakers early on in the tax reform debate here back in 2011 and 2012, that was one of the big motivations, is trying to get income tax rates down in Kansas so you could do better to compete with places like Texas and others that, of course, you've seen high out-migration to places like that. Probably everyone in this room knows somebody or knows a friend of a family member that has moved to Texas because of better economic opportunity. But look at the numbers here. They're really striking, and they're probably pretty small, so I'll read a few of them out. Texas on net has gained more than 1.3 million Americans from the other 49 states over the last 10 years alone. Florida is over 800,000. North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia, the big winners. Those states generally have a philosophy of government staying limited and keeping taxes low. While you have New York almost down 1.5 million Americans. So this strategy of giving away tons of different cronyist provisions while having high taxes, you can see the effect that it's had on New York over the last decade. California, another one. Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey. The kind of the blue state model of big taxes and big government, people continue to vote with their feet against it because there's lack of economic opportunity. And as I mentioned, the 9 states without personal income taxes. There is a growth premium associated with being a state that's not an income tax state, and Texas and Florida are the biggest case studies of this. But we take a look at all 9 that do not tax personal income, and then compare them with the 9 states that have the highest income tax rates across the country. And we look at GSP growth, population growth, tax receipt growth, job growth. And down the line, the states without income taxes are far outperforming the states with the highest income taxes. Now, all taxes matter for economic growth. We know that from Econ 101. When you tax something, you what? You get less of it, right? When you tax something, you get less of it. But not all taxes are created equal. But it turns out, based on the research, both academic and just research from businesses that we know is to be true, taxes on capital income taxes. Taxes on savings and investment, on wage income, are the most damaging form of taxation. And another reason to avoid over-reliance on income taxes is their extreme volatility. So somebody that wants to create a responsible budget for the state going forward, to have responsible estimates, will rely more on consumption taxes and less on capital-based taxes. And even if you don't believe me, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, just came out and said, yeah, we raised taxes a bunch. Their highest income tax, by the way, anybody know what California's highest income tax rate is? 12.5. Close, 13.3% in California. He just came out and said, we've relied too much on these evil millionaires and billionaires that we've wanted to soak it through in this redistribution scheme that California's tried for years. And now he's realized it wasn't such a great idea, because California has been the embodiment of the boom and bust cycle of government. When times are good, California's booming. Capital gains and dividend realizations are coming in. Silicon Valley's doing very well. But when times are bad, back in 2012, and before, you remember California was issuing IOUs because it couldn't pay out state vendors. It didn't have the cash flow because of this boom and bust cycle. And they did that because they were overly reliant on income taxes. Now, in rich states, poor states, we measure the 50 states, 1 through 50, based on free market, tax, budget, regulatory, labor policies. This year, Utah comes out at number 1. As you can tell, Kansas is not in the top 10. Probably not a huge surprise after the tax increases from a couple years ago. Look at the bottom 10. New York is 50th out of 50. Luckily, Kansas doesn't fall in the bottom 10 either. So where does Kansas fall? Kansas falls at number 27. Now, Kansas has seen a bit of a roller coaster over the last few years after tax reform. So one of the motivating factors, of course, for tax reform is making Kansas a more competitive state to live, work, and have a family and have a business. When we started measuring before the tax reform, Kansas was 27th. It went all the way down and improved to number 11 after tax reform. After the recent tax increases, all the way back to number 27 again in terms of economic competitiveness. So there's a real cost to the sales tax increase, to the discriminatory tax increases on vapor products and cigarettes and other things that came in with the big revenue numbers. Now, obviously, Kansas had some highlights still that go for it in terms of not having a death tax, being a right-to-work state, not having an egregious minimum wage. But on the bottom side here, the recently legislated tax changes, as a percentage of income, there have only been 2 or 3 states in the country that increased taxes more than Kansas did over the last 2 years. Pretty incredible to think about. And then, of course, the size of the government workforce, that is the state and local employees as a percentage of the population. Only a couple states in the country have higher percentage of government employees relative to the overall population of the state. So a couple of things that are food for thought. Now, the region, it's not just that Kansas has fallen in economic competitiveness that's concerning, it's that the region is pretty competitive. You know, when you've got Texas and Oklahoma now in the top 10, Missouri beating out Kansas barely, and Colorado always been a big competitor for Kansas, obviously, for decades. We're back to a situation where the only thing keeping Kansas from the bottom of the region is Nebraska, which was the case before we started the exercise of tax reform. Now, the left-wing media, Paul Krugman at the New York Times and others, have spent an inordinate amount of time attacking Kansas. And it has implications here, because all of you are living through this experiment, for better or for worse. But it has implications nationally, because they are trying to make the Kansas tax reform, as I said earlier, so toxic that another state wouldn't dare cut taxes again. And that's the purpose of it. And so for those of us who believe in lower taxes and competitive state government, it is essential that we talk about the Kansas situation properly and in a way that people understand. It's very hard to nuance it into 10-second or 30-second soundbite like it is to say, you know, if you listen to Krugman, you would think Kansas doesn't have paved streets or running water or anything else, and schools have been completely decimated and shut down. Obviously, that's not quite the case here. Now, there's been some issues, and we'll talk through what a couple of those have been. But, you know, first of all, education funding being cut to the bone and plummeted. It depends on how you measure baseline budgeting, right? It gets back to the whole math of budgeting. Is if you ask for $10 million and you get $5 million and you got $2 million last year, is that an increase or a decrease, right? It gets to that whole question. Is the rate of increase of growth slowing a decrease or an increase, right? Those are the questions that so many times people don't ask the answer for, and Krugman and others are able to get away with saying things like education's been cut dramatically. Well, if you look at total spending on education, as KPI and Dave Trauber have pointed out, have hit records, 3 or 4 years in a row now, regardless of what's being talked about, saying education's been completely decimated in Kansas. Another one of my favorites to address is the drop in bond ratings. Now, clearly, bond agencies look at a lot of things when they measure a state's outlook. They look at spending, they look at taxes, they look at debt, they look at pensions. Every time there was bad news coming out of Kansas on the bond rating side, I heard Krugman and his ilk say, of course, it was the taxes that caused the bond rating to go down. And I've heard that being repeated by legislators and governors in other states now, that we can't cut taxes because it's going to hurt our bond rating. Is that true? Absolutely not. If you read the actual report of the bond rating agencies, there was nothing specific to tax cuts they were talking about. It was talking about relying on one-time revenue. It was talking about unfunded pension liabilities, which is always a really big one. And it was talking about just things getting out of balance, right? And so that was another big myth that unfortunately gets talked about quite a bit nationally. And then looking at things like, was Kansas' economy completely decimated by the tax cuts? Now, obviously, numbers are not what you'd like to see them probably, but if you separate out oil and gas, agriculture, aviation, the numbers look a whole lot different. Of course, if you take away those things that you can't do anything about, there's these national and international trends happening right now that policymakers have no control over, the numbers look much, much better than you would see advertised otherwise. And there's a couple of things talking about spending being above inflation. And this is a long-term thing. We got this from Kansas Policy Institute going back to 1995 and taking a look at what spending would be like if it just followed inflation versus what spending is like today. And you see the gap, and of course that's what caused the overall problem in funding and shortfalls in revenue. The model, I think, in what would look much more closely like the red line here, the inflation line, is if Kansas had adopted something like Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which allows government to grow, but only grow at the level of the private sector. Because at the end of the day, how can the public sector continue to grow if the private sector is not growing, right? And it was a constitutional provision put in the early 1990s, and it survived multiple attempts to go on the ballot and decimate it because taxpayers realized it's kept taxes low and it's kept spending in check. And so sometimes it's hard to cut spending overnight, right? I mean, sometimes you don't want to take the shock treatment to spending. You know, there are some good recommendations, I think, out there, like the Alvarez study outlining $2 billion in savings for Kansas based on best practices from other states is probably a good place to start. Or as Davis pointed out, you know, an 8% adjustment would have caused all the budget problems to go away on the spending side. Now, if you don't want to take that strategy, taking the Colorado approach of just limiting the growth of spending to the rate of the private sector is another good way to go that's much less painful perhaps if you can do it over time and not do it overnight. Now, if you don't believe anything I just said about taxes mattering for growth, let me turn to case study number 1 here, and that is Governor Daniel Malloy of Connecticut. As many of you know, he's not a right-wing Republican. Governor Malloy is a liberal Democrat who's now a 2-term governor of Connecticut. Anybody know what just happened in Connecticut this year? They lost the goose that laid the golden egg, and that is General Electric. General Electric had been warning the state for years that they're going to pull out and leave the state if they kept raising taxes. The government, controlled by liberals in both the legislative and executive branches, thought they were bluffing. Turns out they weren't. They picked up and they went to Boston, Massachusetts. Now, there's probably a joke somewhere to say if you're losing businesses to Boston, Massachusetts for lower taxes, you've got a real problem to start with, right? But the fact of the matter is, they did pick up and leave. And if a company like General Electric, which had been in Connecticut for a very long time, since the 1970s, can leave, any company is at risk of leaving if the conditions get bad enough, if taxes are too high, if the cost of doing business is too high in a state, they will pick up and leave. So with that, let me just, I know we're going to take some time for questions here, and I want to get to as much to all of them as I can. But based on our experience of the 50 states, Kansas has some work cut out for it, right? You're doing some really good things on the tax side of the equation by trying to get income tax rates down. That's exactly the kind of tax cut that will provide the biggest bang for the buck in terms of economic growth and long-term economic growth. The other side of the equation is not so easy. It's going to take some discipline on the spending side of the ledger as well. And that's the caveat. I am always a big defender of what Kansas has tried to do on tax reform because I truly believe over the long term it's going to be great for the state. It's going to be good for job creation. It's going to be great for relocation of companies and individuals from other states. But with the caveat, the big caveat, that whenever you have a good tax plan, you have to have a good spending plan to go along with it. Thanks so much for having me today. It's a pleasure.
I'll work my way around the room with the microphone so everyone can hear.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering, in the Kansas legislation, the C corporations are effectively left out of the party. Could you address that? And is that something that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, so the question on C corporations, I'm a fan of cutting taxes no matter the form of business, right? To keep business costs low, regardless of how you choose to organize as a business. There's lots of reasons why people choose to organize different ways, whether it be liability protection or tax reasons. You, at the end of the day, don't want people choosing the form of business just for tax reasons. I would be very supportive of looking to get the C Corp rate down and match it to the individual side of business income. And so you look at the taxes that matter. I mostly talked about individual income taxes today, just because I think that has a huge effect because so many businesses and the startups and the new entrepreneurs are filing as pass-through entities and paying on the personal income tax side. But the same type equation can be done for the states that rely least on the corporate income tax because capital, of course, is so mobile today, and especially for C Corps to move around and change location, it's very important on the C Corp side. So I think it'd be a very good move for Kansas to start moving that rate down as well.
Over here.
Thank you for being our speaker today. You're very knowledgeable and very great to listen to. Donald Trump's campaign has stated that they are going to phase out the IRS as we know it. If you were to be an advisor to the Trump campaign, or let's say that they do prevail and that becomes the executive branch, what would you advise them in terms of fair tax versus flat tax and so on at the national level?
Well, the easy answer is yes. Either one would be much better than the current system that we have today. That being said, I've worked with a lot of fair tax groups. I've worked with a lot of flat tax groups across the country over the years. And one piece of advice I have given to the fair tax people, and I think they're on the right track in terms of getting a reliance on capital-based taxes down or gone altogether, is before we see a win on the federal level, we need to see some additional tangible wins at the state level in terms of states repealing income taxes. So there's only been one state in the history of our republic that has ever repealed its income tax. That was Alaska back in 1980.
New Hampshire?
New Hampshire just never had one. So all the other states just never had an income tax to start, but Alaska did repeal it. That being said, the track record of weaning yourself off of income taxes is extremely difficult, and it takes a long-term approach to spending control. I would say before we expect to see a fair tax happen in Washington, we want to see 2 or 3 other states repeal their personal income taxes at the state level and join the Floridas and the Texas, enjoying the economic growth that's happened in those states.
Jonathan, great to see you again. 2 quick points I'd like you to comment on. First one is Kansas is one of the few states that has a statewide mill levy of 21.5 mils for property tax. I was curious in terms of if your report goes into comparing how the other 49 states do in that regard. And also, Kansas succeeded in getting a huge comparative advantage for about 5 years between 1995 and 99 when there was a moratorium on unemployment insurance taxes on the workforce. How does Kansas compare on unemployment? Because glancing here, that's something that often gets overlooked in these studies.
Right. So unfortunately, I don't have good answers for you on either one of those. The second is unemployment insurance taxes. I always refer people to the Tax Foundation's State Business Tax Climate Index that has one of its subcategories on unemployment insurance taxes that does a good comparison. So I think you'll find that to be helpful on that regard. On the statewide property side, it's a shrinking group of states that still have a statewide levy on property taxes. And I've been told by some, you may know better than I do, Carl, since you're a real pro in this area. I've always respected your opinion on things. some lawmakers have told me we wanted to repeal our statewide property tax and mill levy. They weren't able to do it because they said it had to do with bond rating, and they needed to keep it as a source for the bond rating agencies. So I had never thought of that before. I thought it would be an easy victory to say, hey, let's just repeal a tax and get it off the books. That's what they came back to me with.
Okay, right here.
They've been talking Mike Pence and Indiana's success, and I didn't see it in the top 10 or bottom 10. Can you address where they are and what's really happening there?
Yeah, so the Indiana story is a good story to tell. I don't know if anybody saw the Wall Street Journal this week. There was an editorial on the Indiana comeback story, really. It is in the top 10. It's sorry it was fine print up here, but it's number 6 this year in Economic Outlook. And Indiana's been really one of the big states to move the most over the last 9 years of putting together this research. It was Indiana, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio were the states that really moved the most in the right direction. Indiana was something like 24th just 3 or 4 years ago, all the way up to 6th now. How did they do it? They did it right to work. Indiana was a non-right to work state a few years ago. That happened under Mitch Daniels. Then Governor Pence has continued the momentum that Daniels started on spending reform as well as tax reforms. They've been reducing rates. I think the last 3 years in a row, they've reduced personal income tax and corporate income tax rates. So Indiana's done a lot of good things. They've taken a little bit more of an incremental approach than other states have taken. So North Carolina, as example, they're number 2 now in rich states, poor states, after being in the mid-20s a couple years ago. They went in a much more dramatic fashion. But Indiana has chipped away, and they've used the approach of being able to use spending control then to pay for tax cuts going forward, which is not a bad way to do it if you have the discipline to keep chopping down the rates. That was the approach that Governor Pete DuPont of Delaware did in the 1980s and significantly reduced Delaware's income tax with spending discipline. So I think that's the story of Indiana is, A, they've been a catalyst for change in the Midwest because when Indiana became right to work, how long was it before Michigan and Wisconsin became right to work? Not very long. And being a Michigan native, I never thought in my lifetime I would say my state's a right-to-work state. But Indiana really precipitated that. So they were a leader there. And then on the tax cut, they've been doing things that have been kind of slow, haven't been real noticeable. But over time, they are chipping down those rates and reducing the cost of doing business in Indiana. So I'm a big fan of what Indiana's done. I'm a big fan of Governor Pence. I've had a chance to sit down with him personally a few times. The thing I like about him most, and this is not an endorsement by any stretch of the imagination, just I admire his policy background, and that is his commitment to federalism. His commitment to say that the decisions, whether we like them or not, should not be made in Washington, they should be made in America's state capitals. And the states can be the innovators and the laboratories of democracy, and they realize that they have to compete with each other. And so he set up an office of state-based initiatives in Indiana. Nobody else has this yet. It's a great idea, by the way. He has an office to say, of all the federal funds that are being offered to us as a state, which ones do we want to take versus let's just automatically take them all, because they're looking at the requirements, the costly strings attached to the dollars that come from Washington. Because this is something I'm really concerned about overall, is the way that people could stop this phenomenon of free markets winning across the 50 states in tax competition is by federalizing everything and by having the states become wards of the federal government. And how do they do that? By sending states free money, which is really the states' money that they're sending to Washington, getting the bureaucrats to take a cut of it, and then bribing them when they send it back to you, right? And so having somebody like Governor Pence take the lead to say, no, we're not going to automatically say yes to every single federal fund that's coming back. We're going to evaluate whether it's good for our taxpayers or not. That's something that I'd like to see from a whole lot more governors out there today. You see some states, more than 50% of their entire budget comes from the federal government today. Then there's this debate that was raging here in Kansas. It's raged in many, many other states over the last few years, and that is, do you accept a Medicaid expansion, right? Because there's this free money sitting out there, and that's the allure to say, take the free money. Why aren't we taking the free money? And then you have governors from other states coming out to say, we'll take your free money if you don't take the free money. But at the end of the day, what does it do? It erodes state autonomy, and that's bad for all of us that believe in limited government.
Okay, thank you.
I've been a big proponent of the 401k for the public pensions. If you were running for state senate, how would you sell that to your voters, and how does that affect like the teachers personally, and what does that mean?
Yeah, well, first of all, what you do is you structure it in a way that just applies to new hires. So you honor the promises that you make to current retirees and current workers. You don't want to violate any contracts that you've made. You don't want to betray the promises that the government has made to those people. I can say this is a product of 2 public school teachers and union members in Michigan. Last thing I want for them is to go out to the mailbox one day and that check not be there. The only way for that to happen is if you continue down the road of an unsustainable pension system, though. Unless you make reforms, stuff like that's going to happen probably. We saw it with the Detroit bankruptcy, for instance, right? So the way to talk is sustainability. The only way to preserve the benefits that we've promised to workers and retirees are by creating a new deal for new workers. Secondly, it's great for new workers because nobody of the generation coming into state government out of college is going to work for one employer for 40 years. They're going to be moving around to multiple employers. But the way that the rules are crafted in state pensions, it penalizes them. And in some states, you have to work 10 years to be vested in the system before you see a dime of that retirement, right? And so it's a good deal. It's more flexible. And then you get to the issue, the thing that people try to sink 401ks with is the myth of transition costs. That it's going to somehow cost more to go into a 401k system than it is to stay in the current system that you're at. Which anybody that kind of is good at math realizes it's not a problem because you're on the hook one way or the other. It's the question of is it a least expensive system or is it a more expensive system in terms of administering and what do the benefits look like. And the other way I like to describe it is it's like a mortgage, right? You're set on the hook for that debt no matter what. And if you move it from a 30-year mortgage to a 15-year mortgage, yes, your payments might go up, but the overall cost is going down because you're paying less in total interest. That's basically what you're doing. Your payments go up on pensions if you move it away from DB and go to DC because of some archaic accounting rules. But overall, the total cost is not changing. If anything, you're going to save more going forward.
Jonathan, also on the pension issue, you probably know the state borrowed $1 billion this last year to beat the market as a solution to the pension liability. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of pension obligation bonds necessarily. I mean, the way to use them would be if you needed to as probably a crutch to transition into some sort of a reform program, but to prop up a failing system does nothing but add additional debt, give you a little bit more time maybe, and then you run the risk of beating the market yourself. So I generally don't encourage that kind of new debt being created.
Over here with Carl.
One of our previous speakers, I believe from Fort Hays University, referred to the March to Zero, comparing it to Texas and how they had raised fees on auto registration and other things. Is there any comparison done with the Texas, the states that don't have income taxes, how their fees for other issues compare?
Well, that's a good question, and absolutely states need to find money to pay for core government services. We're not anarchists here saying that you should do away with government, right? The question is how you go about doing that. And generally, the states that don't have income taxes, one of the keys to the success is they spend about 45% less than the states with the highest income taxes. So they keep government more limited. That's really the key to their success. And then when they do tax, they rely a little bit more heavily on sales taxes sometimes, or on property taxes sometimes, or sometimes on fees. So you have to keep a lid on all those things because, like I said when we started, all taxes hurt economic growth. They all matter. So you have to keep the lid on those taxes to make sure they don't get out of whack where, let's say if you get a sales tax that's approaching 10 or 11 or 12% at the state level, you're going to see some real cross-border activity and perhaps more people trying to buy things online and not paying sales taxes and that kind of thing. So no matter how you fund government, you need to keep rates competitive, but the real key to the success of the 9 no income tax states is frugality, and they keep spending more in check.
Just to clarify real quick, that 45%, is that on a per capita basis, or what basis that 45% was?
I think that's just total.
Okay.
Or is that per capita, Dave?
It is per capita. The 9 states, there's 9 states that don't have an income tax. The other 41 states in 2014 spent 48% more per resident than the 9 states without an income tax spent per resident. And even if you look at state and local combined, we also look to see if they push things off to the local government. The 10 highest state and local burden spend 43% more per resident than the 10 lowest state and local residents. It simply comes down to the more you choose to spend, the more you have to tax or charge in fees.
Right. Thank you.
Jonathan, if you were a benevolent dictator
and you were in charge of Kansas, what would your recommendation, what would your actions be to change policy and direction in Kansas?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, we got to tackle the spending side of the equation if you want to continue down the road of tax reductions, right? And I think the way to do that is maybe you start with the low-hanging fruit of the Alvarez study. Then maybe going forward, you kind of make sure that we put some institutional controls in place to have government not grow faster than the private sector, something like a Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights. In the Constitution, preferably. That's what's been able to keep a staying power for Colorado. Is it's the Constitution, and it's tied to something that's meaningful in terms of spending control. Secondly, education, big issue, right? Education reform and creating a system that the dollars follow the kids. You empower kids, you empower parents, right? And whether it's a public school, private school, charter school, homeschool, you allow people to compete, right? And you allow kids to get the best education for them, and you allow parents to decide. I think that's going to be huge, because as long as you've got a Supreme Court here in the state that acts like an appropriations committee, right? And this is not just a problem in Kansas, but it started here, it seems. This education issue is a big one, right? Otherwise, more and more is going to continue to go to the programs. Are you seeing better results for the dollars that are there? Probably not. You look nationally, standardized education scores, relatively flat for the last 30 years, while dollars have continued to go into into K-12 education. And when you put more dollars into K-12, are they going to the classroom? Probably not in most cases. I remember there was this novel concept 10 years ago when I started working in Kansas that a certain percentage of dollars had to be used in the classroom. How many times do you think that was met, right? Not very often. So some big changes on the education side. And then getting back to our 401k question for pensions is you got to cap the liability. It's like a chemical spill. The first thing you do is you got to cap it, right? And you got to transition. It's not going to solve itself overnight. You're going to carry some unfunded liabilities on the books for a while. But if you transition into the 401k model, that's going to be what's sustainable going forward. Those are the three things I think that would put Kansas on a great fiscal path going forward, not just next year, but for many years going forward.
Jonathan Williams, let's give him a standing ovation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Carl.